Small tropical islands such as Zanzibar are surrounded by salt water. Fresh water for drinking and other purposes come from rain that replenishes the island's groundwater reservoir. In many cases, fresh water is a scarce resource. On Zanzibar, only half of rural residents have an adequate domestic water supply. The most common source of fresh water in the villages are wells. But as the rain is seasonal and the water infrastructure inadequate, the wells often run dry. On top of this, the excessive pumping of groundwater for the tourist industry increases the risk of salt water seeping into the freshwater magazine from the sea, thereby destroying the freshwater resource. Let us ask Professor Peter Engelsgaard, a specialist in groundwater, why this saltwater intrusion is happening and how concerned we should be.
I think one should be concerned, and I guess I can give maybe a pretty precise answer actually.
Okay.
Because I can refer to Danish and Spanish conditions where we've done actually experiments and we've done a lot of monitoring. So the problem is that when you install a pump and you start pumping and you're pumping fresh water in the beginning, then after a few years you encounter, oh, now it's salt water. We have a problem. Then that may take 2 years. Then you shut off the pump. But the problem is that you have a saltwater intrusion. And when you shut off the pump, then the heavy saltwater will actually sink to the bottom of your aquifer system. And to push this out, it'll not revert in 2 years.
Okay.
This can take 10 times longer to get back to a natural state. So when the damage is done, it can take a long time for it to revert, unfortunately.
So what you say is, if close to the coast or much further inland on Zanzibar, we have reached a breaking point where there is significant saltwater intrusion, rainfall, the recharging of the groundwater aquifer you have mentioned before would not be enough to push back the saltwater? Or?
Well, what happens is that the salt water has moved maybe 100 meters, 200 meters or 500 meters into the groundwater aquifer due to pumping. When you shut off the pump, so it's like a vertical, so to speak, front of salt water. When you shut off the pump, this will just sink down. And the fresh water that comes from the middle of the island will actually then now just flow on top of this saltwater lens that's laying at the bottom, and it'll not do big pushing anymore.
Okay, so you cannot push back out the salt water once it has settled on the bottom of the reservoir?
Well, broadly speaking, when you're in a natural state and near the coastline, then this saltwater interface has a slope. We call it the saline wedge. When you install a pump and you start pumping, then this will become vertical and it moves inland, and then it hits the pumping well, and you now pump salt water. Then you shut off the pump, and then it lays down like this, and the fresh water comes from behind and more or less just licks off a little bit of salt water, and this licking off of the salt water takes a long time. It's not like a push. If it was like a front like this, it would push it back, but it sinks down to the bottom, and it's more like it's licking off the salt water and taking a little bit every year out, and to get it back to the natural state takes maybe 20 years, decades. That's at least what we have seen in some of the experiments we have done in Denmark and some of the observations, the monitoring. So it's a problem that stays.
So the problem, I imagine, here comes in because the hotels are located almost on the beach. So that leaves them little room for pumping. Is that what you're saying?
I would expect, it all depends on the local conditions, of course, the local hydrogeology. But I would expect that they cannot drill very far down before they will actually encounter the salt water. Even if they only drill down and in the beginning, so in the shallow groundwater, so near the surface, even if they, in the beginning, maybe pump up fresh water, then over time, they may be able to see salt water coming in. And that's is called upconing.
So just to get a little time perspective, I know from the hotels, some of those I went to see, that they have a fairly large compound, and some of them have been attempting to drill for fresh water within their own compound. But most of them are actually getting water through bowsers, trucks that delivers water along pipe, where the source is much further inland. Do you have any idea of the time perspective before a problem arises, comparing the hotel and their pumping on the beach with the water supply that may be 10 or 20 kilometers in country?
It's very difficult to say. It all depends on the local hydrogeology. From what I know, it's a karstic environment with a fissured limestone, and that makes it actually a very complex system. But I would argue that, I mean, if it's close to the coastline, we're talking years to get a problem. If you're more inland, maybe it can work out for decades. Maybe there will not be a problem.
Would it be a possibility to avoid conflict by asking hotels to get their water supply from a much greater distance and reserve the much more localized water resource for all the communities living along the coast to the local community?
I mean, broadly speaking, what happens physically is that you have rainfall, and a part of the rainfall becomes what we call recharge. It's like, we call it recharge because it's like recharging a battery. So it's the part of the rainfall that actually enters the groundwater system. And if it rains like 1,000 millimeters per year on the east coast of Zanzibar, then only a fraction of this is reaching the groundwater system. And this fraction is very important because that's actually the fraction of the groundwater that's pushing back the salt water. If we didn't have this water, then the salt water will keep intruding into the system. So the fresh water is pushing it back. So if the consumption, the pumping by the hotels is of a certain magnitude, then yeah, basically one is taking away this fresh water. And this means that the pushing back is less, and then the intrusion will happen at a greater rate. So if the hotels are using a big portion of the water consumption, it's a big water consumer, then removing them or letting them have the water from another place will certainly, I would argue, would certainly be a good idea.
Access to safe water and sustainable management of the freshwater resource is essential to human health and to environmental sustainability. As long as there's no reliable domestic water supply, the communities will use open wells or ponds where the water might be polluted. The globally expanding tourism sector will place an additional pressure on the 2 billion people already living under water scarcity.